The evening sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows of Murphy's saloon as gentle notes drifted from the old, upright piano in the corner. The melody was soft and sweet, something that reminded the weary cowboys and miners of home, of mothers singing lullabies, of better times before the frontier hardened their hearts. Behind the worn keys sat an old man with silver hair and weathered hands, his fingers moving across the ivory with surprising grace for someone who looked like he had spent decades working with rope and iron. Cornelius Whitmore had been playing piano at Murphy's for 3 years now, ever since he had drifted into Millbrook with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small leather satchel. The townspeople had grown to love his evening concerts, the way he could take a room full of rough men and make them remember they were human. His repertoire ranged from church hymns to popular melodies from back east. But tonight, he played something original, something that seemed to come from deep within his soul. If you are listening to this story tonight, I wonder where you are in the world. Comment below what country or state you are calling home, because music like this has a way of connecting us all, no matter how far apart we might be. The saloon was busier than usual for a Tuesday evening. 3 card games were running at different tables. The bartender was polishing glasses with practiced efficiency, and the usual crowd of ranch hands and drifters nursed their whiskey while listening to the music. There was something peaceful about Murphy's when Cornelius played, something that made even the hardest men set aside their troubles for a while. The piano itself was nothing special to look at. The wood was scratched and stained, several keys had chips in the ivory, and it had not been tuned properly in years. But under Cornelius's touch, it sang like an angel. His fingers were long and elegant despite their obvious age, and they moved with a precision that spoke of decades of practice. Those hands had calluses, old scars that caught the lamplight, and a steadiness that seemed unusual for a man who looked to be well into his 60s. Tonight, Cornelius wore his usual simple clothes. A white cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark wool trousers held up by worn suspenders, and boots that had seen better days. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he read the sheet music spread across the piano's music stand. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a former music teacher from Missouri who had come west to start over after losing his wife. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered when the saloon doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the wall. 3 men stumbled in, clearly having spent the evening drinking somewhere else before arriving at Murphy's. The leader was a big man with crude features, dirty clothes, and a revolver that hung low on his hip in the style of someone who wanted everyone to know he was armed. His name was Dutch Kellerman, and he had a reputation for causing trouble wherever he went. Behind Dutch came 2 companions who looked like the type of men who would follow anyone willing to buy them drinks. One was thin and nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting trouble. The other was broad-shouldered and stupid, the kind of hired muscle who did whatever Dutch told him to do without asking questions. The music continued as the 3 men made their way to the bar, but the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Conversations became quieter, card players glanced toward the door, and more than one patron considered finishing his drink quickly and heading home. Dutch was known for his unpredictable temper and his habit of picking fights with anyone he perceived as weak or different. Dutch ordered a bottle of whiskey and turned to survey the room while his companions flanked him on either side. His eyes eventually settled on the piano player, and a cruel smile spread across his face. The music was gentle and melodic, the kind of thing that Dutch considered weak and feminine. In his mind, real men listened to fiddles and harmonicas, not fancy piano music that sounded like it belonged in some Eastern parlor. "Well, looky here," Dutch said loudly, his words slightly slurred from the evening's drinking. "We got ourselves a real fancy musician playing sissy music for all the refined gentlemen." The sarcasm in his voice was thick as molasses, and several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Cornelius continued playing, his expression unchanged, though his pale blue eyes flicked briefly toward the bar before returning to his sheet music. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with drunk troublemakers was to ignore them completely. Most of the time, they would get bored and move on to easier targets. But Dutch was not the type to be ignored. He had come to Murphy's specifically because he had heard about the piano player and wanted to see for himself what all the fuss was about. In his opinion, Any man who spent his evenings playing pretty music instead of drinking and gambling was probably not much of a man at all. "Hey there, piano man," Dutch called out, his voice getting louder. "I am talking to you. Do not you think it is rude to ignore someone when they are trying to have a conversation?" The music faltered for just a moment, then resumed. Cornelius cleared his throat softly and spoke without looking away from his keys. "Good evening, gentlemen. I hope you enjoy your time at Murphy's tonight." His voice was quiet and polite, with just a hint of an accent that suggested education and refinement. This response only made Dutch angrier. He was not used to being dismissed so casually, especially by someone he considered beneath his notice. "Oh, we got ourselves a real gentleman here, boys. Probably went to some fancy school back east where they teach men to play tea party music." The two companions laughed on cue, though the nervous one kept glancing toward the door as if he was already planning his escape route. The broader man just grinned stupidly and waited for Dutch to tell him what to do next. Cornelius finished the piece he was playing and carefully closed his sheet music. He turned slightly on the piano bench to face Dutch directly, his movements slow and deliberate. "I wonder if you might keep your voice down just a bit," he said calmly. "Some folks are trying to enjoy a peaceful evening." Dutch's face flushed red with anger and alcohol. "A peaceful evening," he repeated mockingly. "Well, I will tell you what would make this evening peaceful for me, old man. You stopping that damned noise you call music and letting real men have a conversation without listening to you plinking away like some church lady." The saloon had gone completely silent now except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of Dutch's heavy breathing. Even the bartender had stopped polishing glasses and was watching the confrontation with growing concern. Everyone in the room knew that Dutch carried a gun and was not afraid to use it, especially when he was drinking. Cornelius removed his spectacles and carefully folded them before placing them on top of the piano. When he looked up, his pale blue eyes seemed different somehow, colder and more focused than they had been moments before. "I am afraid I cannot do that," he said quietly. "This piano belongs to the saloon, and Murphy pays me to play it for his customers. If you have a problem with the music, perhaps you might consider finding another establishment." The words were polite enough, but there was something in the way Cornelius said them that made Dutch's two companions exchange nervous glances. There was no fear in the old man's voice, no tremor of uncertainty. Instead, there was a calm certainty that seemed completely out of place given the circumstances. Dutch pulled his gun and pointed it at the ceiling. The thunderous crack of the gunshot echoed through the saloon, and splinters of wood rained down from the beam above. Several patrons dove for cover, and one of the card games scattered as men knocked over chairs in their haste to get away from the violence. "Now that I have your attention," Dutch said, his gun now pointing in the general direction of the piano, "I think it is time for you to pack up your little music box and find somewhere else to play your pretty songs. This is a place for real men, not for old women who think they can tell us what to do." The gunshot had accomplished exactly what Dutch intended. It had proven his dominance, demonstrated his willingness to use violence, and shown everyone in the room that he was the most dangerous person present. Or at least, that was what he believed. But as the smoke cleared and the echo of the gunshot faded, something unexpected happened. Instead of cowering in fear or hurrying to pack up his music, Cornelius Whitmore simply sat there on his piano bench, looking at Dutch with those pale blue eyes. His hands rested calmly on his knees, and there was no trace of fear in his expression. "That was your warning shot," Cornelius said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent saloon. "I suggest you do not fire another one." The silence that followed Cornelius's quiet warning stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Dutch stared at the old piano player in disbelief, his gun still smoking from the warning shot that had sent splinters raining down from the ceiling. Nobody talked back to Dutch Kellerman, especially not some elderly musician who looked like a stiff breeze could knock him over. The audacity of this old fool was beyond comprehension. "You suggesting I should not fire my gun in a public saloon, old man?" Dutch said, his voice rising with indignation. "This here is my gun, this here is my hand, and I will fire it whenever and wherever I damn well please. You got some nerve telling me what I should or should not do with my own property." Cornelius remained seated on the piano bench, his posture straight and dignified despite the obvious threat. His hands, which had been trembling slightly when the confrontation began, were now completely still. The transformation was subtle but noticeable to anyone paying close attention. Where moments before there had been the natural nervousness of an elderly man facing a dangerous situation, there was now an unnatural calm that seemed completely out of place. "I was not suggesting anything," Cornelius replied, his voice as steady as his hands. "I was simply offering some friendly advice from one gentleman to another. Sometimes it pays to think before acting, especially when innocent people might get hurt." This response only fueled Dutch's anger further. He was not accustomed to being lectured by anyone, much less someone he viewed as a weak old man who spent his evenings playing pretty songs for cowboys and miners. In Dutch's world, strength was measured by how fast you could draw your gun and how willing you were to use it. Everything else was just weakness disguised as civilization. "Innocent people," Dutch repeated mockingly. "The only innocent person I see here is me, trying to enjoy a drink without having to listen to your pathetic excuse for music. You want to know what real music sounds like, Piano Man? Real music sounds like this." Dutch raised his gun and fired directly at the piano. The bullet struck the wooden frame just above the keyboard, sending a shower of splinters across the keys and into Cornelius's lap. The crash of splintering wood mixed with the echo of the gunshot, and several more patrons scrambled for the exit. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the usual saloon odors of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. But instead of flinching or crying out in alarm, Cornelius simply brushed the wood fragments from his trousers with the same care he might use to clean dust from sheet music. His pale blue eyes never left Dutch's face, and there was something in that steady gaze that made the big man shift uncomfortably despite his apparent advantage. "You seem to have damaged Murphy's property," Cornelius observed quietly. "I imagine he will not be pleased when he returns from his business trip tomorrow. Murphy takes great pride in providing entertainment for his customers, and this piano has been part of that entertainment for quite some time." Dutch laughed harshly and gestured toward his companions. "You hear this, boys? The piano man is worried about Murphy being upset. Maybe we should give Murphy something to really be upset about." The nervous companion, whose name was Jake Morrison, was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was taking. He had come along for what he thought would be a simple evening of drinking and maybe some harmless fun at the expense of an old musician. But there was something about the way the piano player was handling himself that set Jake's nerves on edge. In his experience, truly dangerous men often appeared calm right before they exploded into violence. "Dutch, maybe we should just finish our drinks and head over to the Silver Dollar," Jake suggested nervously. "They got a fiddle player there, more our kind of music anyway." But Dutch was too far gone in drink and anger to listen to reason. He had backed himself into a corner with his threats and his violence, and now he felt compelled to follow through or risk looking weak in front of everyone in the saloon. In his twisted logic, the only way to salvage his reputation was to completely humiliate or intimidate the old piano player. "I do not think so, Jake," Dutch said without taking his eyes off Cornelius. "This old fool needs to learn some manners, needs to understand who he is dealing with when he tries to tell me what I can and cannot do." Dutch holstered his gun and stepped away from the bar, moving toward the piano with deliberate menace. His heavy boots echoed on the wooden floor, and the spurs on his heels jingled with each step. The other patrons pressed themselves against the walls, creating a clear path between the gunman and his target. Everyone in the room could sense that violence was about to escalate beyond mere threats and warning shots. "You know what I think, Piano Man," Dutch said as he approached. "I think you have been sitting on that bench so long you've forgotten how to stand up like a real man. Maybe it is time someone reminded you what happens to folks who do not show proper respect." Cornelius turned slightly on the bench to face Dutch directly. His movements were fluid and controlled, lacking any of the stiffness or uncertainty one might expect from a man his age. As Dutch closed the distance between them, Cornelius spoke again, his voice carrying a note of authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "I would strongly advise you to reconsider whatever you are planning, Dutch. Some things, once done, cannot be undone. Some lines, once crossed, change everything that follows." The use of his name caught Dutch by surprise. He had not introduced himself, and he was certain the piano player had never seen him before tonight. But his surprise quickly turned to rage as he interpreted the warning as yet another attempt to tell him what to do. "How do you know my name, old man?" Dutch demanded. "You've been asking around about me, trying to find out who you were dealing with. Well, let me save you the trouble of wondering." Without warning, Dutch grabbed Cornelius by the front of his shirt and hauled him up from the piano bench. The sudden violence of the action sent the sheet music scattering to the floor, and Cornelius's spectacles fell from his face to land with a soft clink on the wooden boards. For a moment, it seemed that the old man might simply collapse under the assault, his elderly frame no match for Dutch's size and strength. But something unexpected happened as Cornelius was pulled to his feet. Instead of stumbling or falling as Dutch expected, the piano player moved with the momentum in a way that suggested training, experience, and muscle memory that had not forgotten years of practice. His balance was perfect, his footing secure, and when he straightened to his full height, he proved to be taller than he had appeared while seated at the piano. Jake Morrison, watching from the bar, felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen that kind of movement before, during his brief stint in the cavalry before deserting and turning to petty crime. It was the way professional fighters moved, the way men who had been trained to kill moved when they were preparing for violence. The piano player's apparent frailty was melting away like snow in the spring sun. "Now that is more like it," Dutch said, apparently unaware of the subtle change in his opponent. "Let me see those soft musician hands up close. See if they got any calluses from actual work or if they just soft as a woman's." Dutch grabbed Cornelius's right hand and held it up to examine it in the lamplight. What he saw should have given him pause, should have warned him that he was making a terrible mistake. The hand was not soft or pampered as he had expected. Instead, it was marked with old scars, calluses in specific patterns, and a ridge of thick skin along the side that spoke of years spent gripping something much harder and more dangerous than piano keys. But Dutch was too drunk and too committed to his course of action to properly interpret what he was seeing. He squeezed Cornelius's hand hard, trying to cause pain and demonstrate his physical superiority. Instead of crying out or trying to pull away, Cornelius simply looked at Dutch with those pale blue eyes and spoke in a voice that had grown noticeably colder. "You are making a serious mistake, son. This is your last chance to walk away with your pride and your health intact. After this moment, I will not be able to offer you that option again." Dutch laughed and squeezed harder, grinding the bones in Cornelius's hand together. But instead of the weakness he expected to feel, he encountered strength that surprised him. The old man's hand did not tremble or give way under the pressure. If anything, it seemed to be getting steadier, more solid, as if the violence was awakening something that had been sleeping. "You threatening me now, piano man?" Dutch snarled. "You think your fancy words scare me? I have killed better men than you for less reason than you have given me tonight." Cornelius's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture, something so subtle that only someone with extensive experience in reading dangerous men would have noticed it. His shoulders settled slightly, his weight distributed more evenly between his feet, and his free hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his side. Jake Morrison caught the movement and felt his mouth go dry with sudden fear. "I am not threatening you," Cornelius said quietly. "I am simply explaining the situation as it stands. You have damaged property that does not belong to you. You have threatened innocent people, and you have now committed assault. The law tends to take a dim view of such behavior, even out here on the frontier." Dutch's response was swift and vicious. He drew back his free hand and slapped Cornelius hard across the face, the sound of the blow echoing through the saloon like a gunshot. The force of the strike should have sent an elderly man staggering, should have broken his composure and reduced him to pleading or cowering. Instead, Cornelius's head moved with the blow in a way that minimized its impact, another sign of training and experience that Dutch was too angry to recognize. When he straightened and looked back at Dutch, there was blood on his lip, but his expression remained unchanged. If anything, the violence seemed to have brought a terrible clarity to those pale blue eyes. The old rancher sitting at a corner table, a man named Thomas Garrett who had lived through 30 years of frontier violence, suddenly pushed back his chair and stood up. He had been watching the confrontation with growing unease, but it was only when he saw how Cornelius handled that slap that recognition hit him like a lightning bolt. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Those are Duelist hands." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Several patrons who knew Thomas's reputation for reading dangerous men correctly turned to stare at him in confusion and growing alarm. If Thomas Garrett said a man was dangerous, it was wise to listen. Dutch heard the whispered words, but chose to ignore their significance. He was too committed to his course of violence, too intoxicated by drink and rage to consider that he might have misjudged his opponent. Instead, he released Cornelius's hand and stepped back slightly, his own hand moving toward the gun on his hip. "I do not know what you think you see, old-timer," Dutch called out to Thomas, "but all I see is a piano player who needs to be taught some respect." Cornelius bent slowly to retrieve his spectacles from the floor, his movements careful and deliberate. As he cleaned the lenses on his shirt and placed them back on his nose, he spoke without looking at Dutch. "My name is Cornelius Whitmore," he said quietly. "Perhaps you have heard it mentioned in certain circles, in certain stories told around certain campfires. If you have not, then you are about to learn something new tonight." Dutch drew his gun and pointed it directly at the piano, his finger tight on the trigger. His message was clear: sit down and play, or watch the instrument be destroyed completely. But instead of complying or pleading for mercy, Cornelius straightened to his full height and looked Dutch directly in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of absolute certainty that comes only from a man who has been tested by fire and emerged victorious more times than he cared to remember. "You just made the last mistake of your life, son." Thomas Garrett's words hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder, but Dutch was too far gone in drink and rage to properly process their meaning. All he knew was that some old rancher was trying to interfere with his business, trying to make him look weak in front of the entire saloon. Dutch kept his gun trained on the piano while glaring at Thomas with obvious contempt. "Duelist hands," Dutch repeated mockingly. "What kind of nonsense is that supposed to mean, old-timer?" This here piano player got soft musician fingers, probably never held anything heavier than sheet music in his whole worthless life. But Thomas Garrett was backing slowly toward the door, his weathered face pale with recognition and growing fear. Thomas had spent 3 decades surviving on the frontier by learning to read dangerous men correctly, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to get as far away from Cornelius Whitmore as possible. The name alone should have been enough to send Dutch running, but apparently the younger man had never heard the stories. "Dutch, that is Cornelius Whitmore," Thomas said urgently. "The Cornelius Whitmore. You need to holster that gun right now and apologize while you still can." Dutch laughed harshly and spat on the floor near Cornelius's feet. "I do not care if his name is Jesus Christ himself. He disrespected me, and now he is going to pay the price. Ain't that right, piano man?" Cornelius adjusted his spectacles with movements that were becoming increasingly precise and controlled. The transformation that had begun when Dutch first grabbed him was continuing, and those who knew what to look for could see the elderly musician's facade falling away like autumn leaves. His posture was straighter, his movements more fluid, and those pale blue eyes had taken on a quality that made strong men uncomfortable. "Thomas, perhaps you should step outside," Cornelius suggested quietly. "Take anyone with you who values their safety. What happens next is not going to be pleasant to watch." The calm certainty in Cornelius's voice sent a chill through the remaining patrons. Several more men headed for the door, including 2 of the card players who had been trying to remain invisible during the confrontation. Jake Morrison was tugging on Dutch's sleeve, trying to get his attention, but Dutch shrugged him off violently. "Boss, maybe we should listen to the old man," Jake whispered urgently. "Something ain't right here. The way he is standing, the way he is talking, it is like he knows something we do not." Dutch backhanded Jake across the face without taking his eyes off Cornelius. "Shut your mouth, you yellow coward. We come here to have some fun, and that is exactly what we are going to do. This piano player thinks he can scare us with his fancy words and mysterious reputation, but I got news for him." Dutch grabbed a heavy wooden chair and raised it over his head, preparing to smash it down on the piano keys. The threat was clear: submit to humiliation or watch the instrument be destroyed completely. In Dutch's experience, this was usually the moment when his victims broke down and begged for mercy. Instead, Cornelius removed his spectacles again and set them carefully on top of the piano, well away from where the flying wood splinters would land. His movements were unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if he was performing a ritual he had completed many times before. When he looked up at Dutch, His pale blue eyes seemed to have grown several degrees colder. "That piano belonged to my late wife," Cornelius said quietly. "She saved for 2 years to buy it, had it shipped all the way from St. Louis so we could have music in our home. When she passed 5 years ago, it was the only thing of hers I kept." Dutch hesitated for a moment, the chair still raised above his head. There was something in Cornelius's voice that gave him pause, a note of genuine grief that even his drunken rage could recognize. But the moment of uncertainty passed quickly, replaced by renewed anger at having his violent momentum interrupted by sentiment. "Well, ain't that just heartbreaking?" Dutch snarled. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to mouth off to me. Now you can watch me turn your precious wife's piano into kindling." Dutch began to bring the chair down toward the keys, but something made him freeze midway through the motion. Cornelius had not moved to stop him, had not even raised his hands defensively. Instead, the piano player was simply standing there with his arms at his sides, watching Dutch with an expression that was completely devoid of fear or uncertainty. It was Thomas Garrett who finally broke the spell of silence that had fallen over the saloon. The old rancher's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, and his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Dutch Kellerman, you damn fool. That man killed Gentleman Jim Morrison in Dodge City. Shot down Black Jack McCready in Tombstone. He put bullets through the Dalton twins in the same afternoon, and they was both faster than you will ever be." The chair slipped from Dutch's suddenly nerveless fingers and crashed to the floor beside the piano. Morrison, that was Jake's last name, and suddenly the nervous man's behavior made terrible sense. If Cornelius Whitmore had killed Gentleman Jim Morrison, then Jake was looking at the man who had orphaned him, the legendary duelist who had ended his father's notorious career. Jake Morrison was backing toward the door now, his face white as fresh snow and his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had heard the stories all his life, had grown up knowing that somewhere out there was the man who had put a bullet through his father's heart in a fair fight on the main street of Dodge City. The man standing beside that piano was a ghost from his worst nightmares. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Jake whispered. "Boss, that is the angel of death himself. My father used to tell stories, said Whitmore was the fastest gun he had ever seen, faster than Wild Bill, faster than anybody." Dutch's gun was wavering in his hand now, no longer pointing steadily at the piano. The alcohol that had fueled his courage was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold sobriety that came with the realization that he might have bitten off considerably more than he could chew. But his pride would not let him back down, would not let him show weakness in front of everyone in the saloon. "That is just stories," Dutch said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Old wives' tales and campfire nonsense. This here is just an old piano player who thinks he can scare me with a reputation from 20 years ago." Cornelius began to unbutton his shirt cuffs and roll up his sleeves with deliberate care. The motion revealed forearms that were lean and corded with muscle, marked with scars that spoke of violence and conflict. On his right wrist was a thin white line that could only have come from a knife blade, and on his left forearm was a puckered scar that marked where a bullet had once passed through. 37 years ago, to be precise, Cornelius said conversationally. "I had my last formal duel 37 years ago against a man named Terrence Black in Silver Creek, Montana. Shot him through the heart at 20 paces. After that, I retired from the profession and tried to make an honest living." The casual way Cornelius spoke about killing a man sent ice water through Dutch's veins. There was no boasting, no emotion, just the matter-of-fact recitation of someone discussing the weather or the price of cattle. It was the voice of a man who had killed so many times that it no longer registered as anything more significant than any other job of work. "You are bluffing," Dutch said desperately, "trying to spook me with ghost stories and old scars. Cornelius Whitmore is supposed to be some kind of legend, but all I see is an old man who plays piano for nickels and dimes." Cornelius finished rolling up his sleeves and clasped his hands behind his back in a stance that was somehow both relaxed and ready for instant action. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had commanded respect through demonstrated competence rather than bluster and threats. "I fought 53 formal duels during my career as a professional. 53 men called me out, 53 men drew their guns intending to kill me, and 53 men died in the dirt while I walked away. I was 22 years old when I started, and I was 38 when I stopped. The newspapers used to call me the Pale Rider, on account of my eyes and my habit of wearing light-colored clothing. The silence in the saloon was so complete that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like thunder. Every patron who remained was pressed against the walls, trying to make themselves as small as possible while witnessing what might be the last minutes of Dutch Kellerman's life. Even the bartender had disappeared behind the bar, leaving only the top of his head visible as he crouched among the bottles. Thomas Garrett's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke, but his words carried clearly through the silence. He trained John Wesley Harden for 6 months, taught him everything he knew about gunfighting. When Harden finally got good enough to think he could take his teacher, Whitmore put him in the hospital for 3 weeks without even drawing his gun. Dutch's face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray color that matched the ash in the fireplace. His gun hand was trembling now, and sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The stories were too specific, too detailed, and Thomas Garrett's obvious terror was too genuine to be dismissed as mere legend. But Dutch was trapped by his own actions and his own pride. He had gone too far to back down gracefully, had committed himself to a course of violence that could only end in blood. His companions had already abandoned him, Jake Morrison having slipped out the door while Dutch was distracted by the revelation. Even his silent, broad-shouldered partner had managed to disappear, leaving Dutch alone to face the consequences of his actions. "I do not believe you," Dutch said, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. "You are just an old man trying to save his skin with tall tales and intimidation. If you really was this Pale Rider character, you would be dead by now. Men like that do not retire, they die with their boots on." Cornelius nodded as if Dutch had made a reasonable point. "You are quite correct that most professional gunfighters die violent deaths. I was fortunate enough to find something worth living for, something that mattered more to me than my reputation or my skill with a gun. I met a woman named Sarah, married her, and tried to become the kind of man she deserved." The mention of his wife's name brought a softness to Cornelius's voice that had not been there before, but it was accompanied by a hardening of his expression that made Dutch take an involuntary step backward. The combination of grief and controlled rage in those pale blue eyes was more terrifying than any amount of shouting or posturing could have been. "Sarah made me promise to hang up my guns, to stop the killing, and find a peaceful way to live. I kept that promise for 26 years, until the day she died. Since then, I have been trying to honor her memory by living the quiet life she wanted for us. Playing piano, reading books, tending a small garden behind the boarding house." Dutch's gun was shaking so badly now that he could barely keep it pointed in Cornelius's general direction. The weight of what he was facing was beginning to sink in, and he was starting to understand that he might have challenged the most dangerous man in 3 territories to a gunfight. But his pride and his fear were warring with each other, creating a paralysis that left him standing there with a loaded gun in his hand and no clear idea of what to do next. Cornelius took a single step forward, and Dutch immediately raised his weapon higher, pointing it directly at the piano player's chest. The distance between them was perhaps 10 feet, close enough that even a mediocre shot could hardly miss. But instead of showing fear or concern, Cornelius simply continued speaking in that same calm, conversational tone. "The thing about retirement, son, is that it only works if people let you stay retired. Most folks are decent enough to leave an old man in peace, especially when that old man has earned his rest through 37 years of hard service. But every now and then, someone comes along who mistakes kindness for weakness, who thinks that because a man chooses not to fight, it means he has forgotten how." Dutch tried to speak, but found that his mouth had gone dry, and his tongue seemed to be stuck to the roof of his mouth. The gun in his hand felt impossibly heavy, and his heart was beating so fast that he could hear it in his ears like the sound of galloping horses. Everything about this situation had gone wrong, had spiraled far beyond his control, and he was beginning to realize that he might not survive the next few minutes. "The last man who made that mistake was named Frank Carson," Cornelius continued. "He came into a restaurant in Denver where Sarah and I were having dinner on our anniversary. Started making crude comments about my wife, suggesting that she was too good for an old man like me. When I asked him politely to stop, he decided to prove his point by challenging me to step outside." Cornelius's hands moved to his sides in a motion so subtle that Dutch almost missed it But suddenly the piano player's fingers were resting just inches from where a gun belt would normally hang. The casual readiness of the position sent a fresh wave of terror through Dutch, who was beginning to understand that he was completely outclassed in every possible way. Frank Carson was 26 years old, Dutch heard Cornelius say. He had killed 4 men in gunfights and thought that made him dangerous. He lasted exactly 3 seconds from the time he drew his gun to the time he hit the ground. I buried him the next morning and bought flowers for his grave, because Sarah said every man deserves to be mourned by someone. Dutch's hand was shaking so violently now that he could no longer aim the gun with any accuracy. His face was soaked with sweat, and he could feel his knees beginning to buckle under the weight of his fear. The stories were too real, too detailed, and the man telling them was too calm, too certain of his own abilities. Now then, Dutch Kellerman, Cornelius said quietly, you have a choice to make, and you need to make it quickly. You can holster that gun, apologize for the damage you have caused, and walk out of here with your life and your health intact. Or you can continue down the path you have chosen and discover exactly why they used to call me the Pale Rider. The silence that followed was so complete that Dutch could hear his own ragged breathing echoing off the walls of the saloon. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting to see what he would do next. But Dutch Kellerman, for perhaps the first time in his violent life, was completely and utterly paralyzed by fear. The weight of recognition settled over the saloon like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. Dutch stood frozen with his gun pointed at Cornelius, but the weapon might as well have been carved from wood for all the confidence he felt in his ability to use it effectively. The stories Thomas Garrett had told were echoing in his mind, mixing with the alcohol in his system to create a toxic cocktail of fear and confusion. Cornelius waited patiently for Dutch to process what he had learned, his pale blue eyes never wavering from the younger man's face. There was no hurry in his posture, no impatience or anxiety. He had been in this exact situation more times than he cared to remember, standing across from a man who had finally realized that he had bitten off far more than he could chew. The outcome was always the same, differing only in how long it took for reality to penetrate his opponent's pride. You want to know why I became a professional duelist? Cornelius said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of accumulated wisdom and regret. It was not because I enjoyed killing, despite what the newspapers used to write about me. It was because I was very good at it, and in those days, being good at something was usually enough reason to make it your profession. Dutch tried to speak, but found that his voice had deserted him entirely. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air on the bank of a stream. The gun in his hand felt impossibly heavy, and he was beginning to wonder if he would be able to lift it high enough to aim properly when the time came to use it. I was 16 years old when I killed my first man, Cornelius continued conversationally. His name was Billy Thompson, and he was trying to rob a stagecoach outside of Amarillo. I was riding shotgun for the Wells Fargo Company, earning 50 cents a day and learning how to stay alive in a country that did not much care whether a boy lived or died. Billy drew on me, and I put a bullet through his heart before he could clear leather. The casual way Cornelius spoke about taking a life sent ice water through Dutch's veins. There was no pride in the telling, no satisfaction or boasting. It was simply a fact being recounted, like discussing the weather or the price of grain. The complete absence of emotion was somehow more terrifying than any amount of passionate threats could have been. After that, word got around that I was fast with a gun. Men started seeking me out, wanting to test themselves against the kid who had killed Billy Thompson. I obliged them, because in those days I thought that being fast with a gun was the most important thing a man could be. I thought it made me special, made me somebody worth knowing. Cornelius began to walk slowly around the room, his movements fluid and controlled. Dutch turned to keep him in sight, his gun tracking the piano player's movement, but his hands were shaking so badly that accurate aim was becoming impossible. The other patrons pressed themselves against the walls, trying to stay out of the line of fire while remaining close enough to witness what promised to be a legendary confrontation. By the time I was 25, I had killed 30 men in formal duels. 30 human beings who had families and friends and dreams, all of them dead because they thought they could outdraw Cornelius Whitmore. I was famous from California to New York, written about in newspapers and dime novels. People would travel hundreds of miles just to watch me fight, just to see the Pale Rider in action. Dutch finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "What changed your mind about it all?" he managed to ask. "What made you want to stop?" A smile touched the corners of Cornelius's mouth, but it was not a happy expression. It was the smile of a man remembering something beautiful that had been lost forever, something precious that could never be recovered or replaced. I met Sarah McKinney at a church social in Kansas City. She was 23 years old, had hair the color of autumn wheat, and she played piano like an angel singing. I had gone to the social because I was hiding from a man named Black Pete Morrison who was looking to challenge me, and the church seemed like a safe place to spend the evening. The mention of Morrison made Dutch glance around nervously, remembering that Jake Morrison had fled the saloon when he learned who Cornelius really was. If this legendary gunfighter had killed Jake's father, then the nervous young man's terror suddenly made perfect sense. "Sarah was playing hymns when I walked in," Cornelius continued. "Beautiful, peaceful music that seemed to wash away all the violence and death that followed me wherever I went. I sat in the back pew and listened for 3 hours, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than the constant readiness for killing that had become my normal state of mind." Dutch lowered his gun slightly, drawn in despite himself by the story. There was something in Cornelius's voice when he spoke about his wife that touched even Dutch's whiskey-soaked heart, a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with the reputation for deadly violence. After the social ended, I introduced myself to her, told her my real name and what I did for a living, figuring that would be the end of any possibility of friendship. But Sarah just looked at me with those green eyes of hers and said that she had been praying for someone to come along who needed saving more than she needed safety. Cornelius stopped walking and turned to face Dutch directly. The distance between them was perhaps 8 feet now, close enough that both men could see the details of each other's expressions. Dutch could see the lines of grief around Cornelius's eyes, the weight of loss that no amount of time seemed able to diminish. We were married 6 months later, and I hung up my guns the day after the wedding. Bought a little house in Missouri, started teaching music lessons to the local children, and tried to become the kind of man Sarah deserved to have as a husband. For 26 years, I never touched a gun except to clean the rust off them. The transformation that had been building in Cornelius throughout the confrontation was becoming more pronounced now. His posture was straighter, his movements more precise, and there was an alertness in his eyes that suggested a mind calculating distances, angles, and possibilities with the cold efficiency of a professional killer. But Dutch was too caught up in the story to notice the subtle changes. The alcohol in his system, combined with the emotional impact of hearing about love and loss, had temporarily overridden his survival instincts. He found himself genuinely curious about how a legendary gunfighter had managed to walk away from a life of violence. "What happened to her?" Dutch asked. "How did she die?" The question hit Cornelius like a physical blow. For a moment, the mask of calm professionalism slipped, and Dutch could see the raw pain that still lived in the piano player's heart 5 years after his wife's death. When Cornelius spoke again, his voice was rougher, edged with a grief that time had not been able to heal. "Consumption took her, slowly and without mercy. I watched the strongest, most beautiful woman I ever knew waste away to nothing over the course of 18 months. She made me promise that I would not go back to the guns after she was gone, made me swear that I would find another way to live, another way to honor her memory." Dutch felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the old piano player. He had never been married himself, had never experienced the kind of love that Cornelius was describing. But he could recognize genuine grief when he heard it, and there was no mistaking the authentic pain in the other man's voice. "That piano behind you was her pride and joy," Cornelius said quietly. "She saved every penny for 2 years to buy it, had it shipped all the way from St. Louis because she said we needed music in our home. She spent her last 3 months teaching me to play, said that way she would always be with me even after she was gone." Dutch glanced back at the piano he had damaged, seeing it with new eyes now that he understood its significance. The bullet hole in the wooden frame seemed to stare at him accusingly, a reminder of the thoughtless violence he had inflicted on something that held irreplaceable sentimental value. But Cornelius was not finished with his story. His voice had grown colder now, more controlled, and there was a quality to his stillness that reminded Dutch of a coiled spring ready to unleash devastating force. For 5 years, I kept my promise to Sarah. I traveled from town to town, playing piano in saloons and hotels, living quietly and bothering no one. I thought I had successfully buried the pale rider, thought I could spend the rest of my life honoring my wife's memory through music and peaceful living. The last word was spoken with such finality that Dutch felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. There was something in Cornelius's tone that suggested the peaceful chapter of his life was about to come to an abrupt and violent end. But then men like you come along, Cornelius continued. Men who mistake kindness for weakness, who think that because someone chooses not to fight, it means they have forgotten how. Men who have no respect for art or beauty or the things that make life worth living. Dutch raised his gun again, suddenly aware that the atmosphere in the room had changed dramatically. The storytelling was over, and something much more dangerous was taking its place. Cornelius's entire demeanor had shifted, becoming colder and more focused with each passing second. Now you listen here, old man, Dutch said desperately. I do not care what you used to be, what you used to do. That was 30 years ago, and you are old now, old and slow and soft from playing piano instead of practicing with a gun. You think you can scare me with stories about dead men and ancient history, but I am still young and fast and mean. Cornelius nodded as if Dutch had made a reasonable point. You are quite correct that 30 years is a long time. Reflexes do slow down with age, eyesight becomes less sharp, and hands that once moved like lightning learn to move with the deliberate care required for delicate work like playing piano. Dutch felt a surge of confidence at this acknowledgement of physical reality. Maybe the old man was not as dangerous as his reputation suggested. Maybe time and age had dulled the skills that had once made him legendary. But Cornelius was not finished speaking. However, there are some things that become easier with age, not harder. Things like patience and the ability to read an opponent correctly, and the wisdom that comes from having survived more life-or-death situations than you can probably imagine. Dutch's confidence began to evaporate as quickly as it had arrived. There was something in Cornelius's voice that suggested he was not nearly as concerned about his advanced age as Dutch thought he should be. More importantly, Cornelius continued, the kind of muscle memory that comes from killing 53 men in formal duels does not simply disappear because a man chooses to play piano for a few years. It goes dormant, like a snake sleeping through winter, but it never really dies. Without warning, Cornelius's right hand moved in a blur of motion that was so fast Dutch's eyes could not track it. One moment the piano player's hand was at his side, and the next moment it was extended as if holding a gun, his thumb cocked back as if pulling a hammer, his finger positioned as if squeezing a trigger. The entire motion had taken perhaps a quarter of a second. Dutch staggered backward in shock, his own gun wavering wildly as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The speed and precision of that mock draw had been inhuman, faster than anything he had ever seen before. If Cornelius had actually been holding a gun, Dutch would already be dead. Sweet Jesus, Thomas Garrett whispered from his position near the door. He still has it. After all these years, he still has it. Cornelius lowered his hand slowly, his expression unchanged. That was at about half speed, he informed Dutch conversationally. I am getting old, after all, and I have not practiced that particular motion for quite some time. But I think it should be sufficient for our current purposes. Dutch's face had gone completely white, and his gun hand was shaking so violently that he had to use his other hand to steady it. The demonstration of speed had shattered any illusions he might have had about his chances in a straight gunfight with Cornelius Whitmore. But instead of backing down or trying to find a graceful way out of the situation, Dutch's fear transformed itself into rage. He had been made to look foolish in front of an entire saloon, had been lectured and intimidated by a man he had originally dismissed as a harmless old piano player. His pride would not allow him to simply walk away, even though his survival instincts were screaming at him to do exactly that. I do not care how fast you used to be, old man, Dutch snarled. Speed ain't everything in a gunfight. Sometimes being young and strong and mean is more important than being fast and fancy. To emphasize his point, Dutch stepped forward and spat directly on the piano keys, the tobacco-stained saliva landing with a wet splat on the ivory that Sarah Whitmore had touched so lovingly during the last months of her life. The insult was deliberate and calculated, designed to provoke Cornelius into making a mistake. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Cornelius went completely still, his entire body freezing as if he had been turned to stone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees, and even the bravest of the remaining patrons began edging toward the exits. When Cornelius finally spoke, his voice was so cold that it seemed to come from beyond the grave. "You just made the last mistake of your worthless life, son." Dutch laughed wildly, his fear and rage combining into a kind of hysterical bravado. "Prove it, old man. Stop talking about what you used to be and show me what you are now. I challenge you to a formal duel, right here and right now." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Thomas Garrett closed his eyes and shook his head, knowing that he was about to witness the execution of Dutch Kellerman. There was no coming back from a formal challenge to Cornelius Whitmore, especially not after desecrating the memory of the man's beloved wife. Cornelius straightened to his full height, and suddenly he seemed to tower over everyone else in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had walked through the valley of death so many times that it no longer held any mysteries for him. "Very well, Dutch Kellerman. I accept your challenge. We will step outside and settle this matter according to the traditional code. 20 paces, turn and fire on my count. Winner takes all, loser feeds the worms." Dutch swallowed hard but nodded his agreement. There was no backing down now, no way to escape the consequences of his actions. He had challenged the Pale Rider to a formal duel, and now he would have to live with the results. Or die with them, as the case might be. The saloon emptied with remarkable speed as word of the formal challenge spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Within minutes, half the town had gathered in the dusty street outside Murphy's establishment, forming a wide circle around the two men who were about to settle their differences according to the oldest law of the frontier. The crowd maintained a respectful distance, knowing that stray bullets had a way of finding innocent bystanders during gunfights. Dutch emerged from the saloon first, his swagger somewhat diminished, but his pride still intact. The cool night air hit his flushed face like a slap, helping to clear some of the whiskey fog from his brain. As his vision sharpened and his thinking became more coherent, the full magnitude of what he had committed himself to began to sink in. He was about to face the legendary Pale Rider in single combat, and the odds of surviving the encounter were not encouraging. Cornelius followed a few moments later, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had performed this ritual many times before. He had removed his suspenders and rolled his white sleeves up past the elbows, revealing forearms that were lean and corded with muscle despite his age. In his right hand, he carried a gun belt that had been hidden somewhere in the saloon, probably behind the piano where Sarah's other possessions were kept. The weapon itself was a thing of beauty and terror. The holster was hand-tooled black leather, worn smooth by years of use, and the gun but that protruded from it was polished walnut with silver inlays that caught the moonlight. Even from a distance, Dutch could see that this was not some store-bought weapon, but a custom piece crafted specifically for a professional gunfighter. Thomas Garrett approached Cornelius with obvious reluctance, his weathered face grave with the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. As the most respected man in the crowd, he had been chosen to serve as the official witness and timekeeper for the duel, a role he had never wanted and hoped never to perform. "Cornelius," Thomas said quietly, "you do not have to do this. The boy is drunk and stupid, but he does not deserve to die for it. Maybe you could just wound him, teach him a lesson without taking his life." Cornelius was checking his gun with the same careful attention he usually devoted to tuning the piano. He opened the cylinder, examined each cartridge, tested the action, and verified the balance with movements that were fluid and automatic. Every motion spoke of decades of familiarity with the weapon and absolute confidence in its reliability. "He spat on my wife's piano, Thomas," Cornelius said quietly. "That was not drunken stupidity. That was deliberate cruelty designed to cause the maximum amount of pain possible. Some insults cannot be overlooked. Some lines cannot be uncrossed." Thomas nodded reluctantly, understanding the code that governed such matters even if he did not approve of it. In the world where Cornelius Whitmore had learned his trade, certain behaviors demanded certain responses, and there was no room for compromise or mercy when fundamental principles were at stake. Dutch was pacing back and forth in the street, trying to work off his nervous energy while simultaneously psyching himself up for the confrontation. His gun was already in his hand, and he was taking practice draws, trying to convince himself that 30 years was long enough for even the Pale Rider's legendary skills to deteriorate significantly. "You ready to die, old man?" Dutch called out, his voice carrying a bravado that fooled no one, least of all himself. "I've been practicing with this gun since I was 12 years old, and I ain't never been beat in a fair fight." Cornelius finished his weapon inspection and strapped the gun belt around his waist with practiced efficiency. The weight of the gun at his hip seemed to complete some transformation that had been building throughout the evening. The gentle piano player was gone completely now, replaced by something cold and deadly that belonged to an earlier, more violent time. "I am sure you have had your share of victories," Cornelius replied calmly. "But I suspect that most of your opponents were farmers and shopkeepers, men who carried guns for protection rather than profession. Tonight, you face someone who made killing his life's work for 16 years. The crowd fell silent as the two men took their positions in the center of the street, 20 paces apart, as tradition demanded, with their backs to each other and their weapons holstered. Thomas Garrett stood off to one side with his pocket watch in hand, ready to count down the final seconds of what everyone expected to be Dutch Kellerman's life. Dutch could feel his heart hammering in his chest like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. His mouth was dry despite the whiskey he had consumed, and his palms were slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run, to find some excuse to back out of the duel before it was too late. But pride is a powerful thing, and Dutch's pride had been wounded too deeply to allow for retreat. He had challenged the Pale Rider in front of half the town, had spat on the man's most precious memory, and had committed himself to a course of action that could only end in blood. There was no honorable way out, no graceful escape from the consequences of his own actions. Cornelius stood as still as a statue, his breathing slow and controlled, his mind clear and focused on the task ahead. This was familiar ground for him, a ritual he had performed 53 times before with 53 different opponents. The outcome had always been the same, and he saw no reason to expect tonight to be any different. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as Thomas raised his pocket watch and prepared to begin the count. Most of them had heard stories about formal duels, but few had ever witnessed one firsthand. There was something both thrilling and terrible about watching two men prepare to kill each other according to rules that were older than the territory itself. "Gentlemen," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly through the still night air. "When I reach 10, you will turn and fire. The count begins now." 1. Dutch felt his muscles tense involuntarily. His right hand hovered near his gun, but fingers already curved to grip the handle when the moment came to draw. He tried to remember everything he had ever learned about gunfighting, every trick and technique that might give him an edge against his legendary opponent. 2. Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was facilitating. 3. Cornelius remained motionless, his breathing unchanged, his posture relaxed but ready. In his mind, he was already seeing the sequence of movements that would unfold in the next few seconds. Draw, aim, fire, all performed with the mechanical precision of a man who had reduced killing to a series of technical problems to be solved. 4. 5. Dutch's confidence was beginning to crumble as the reality of the situation pressed down on him like a physical weight. He was about to face a man who had never lost a duel, never failed to kill his opponent, never shown mercy when the chips were down. The stories might be 30 years old, but the man telling them was standing 20 paces away, calm as ice and twice as deadly. 6. 7. The crowd held its collective breath as the count approached its climax. Some of the spectators had covered their eyes, unable to watch what they expected to be a massacre. Others leaned forward eagerly, not wanting to miss any detail of what might be the last formal duel they would ever witness. 8. Dutch's hand was trembling now, and he could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool air. His gun felt impossibly heavy in its holster, and he was beginning to doubt his ability to draw it quickly enough when the crucial moment arrived. The alcohol in his system, which had given him courage earlier in the evening, was now working against him, slowing his reflexes and clouding his judgment. 9. Cornelius took one deep breath and let it out slowly, his mind achieving the state of perfect calm that was essential for accurate shooting. In a few seconds, he would be required to draw, aim, and fire faster than the man behind him could perform the same sequence of actions. He had done it 53 times before, and muscle memory older than most of the spectators would guide his movements tonight. 10. Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Turn and fire. Both men spun around simultaneously, their hands flashing toward their weapons with desperate speed. Dutch's draw was fast, faster than most men could manage under the best of circumstances. His gun cleared leather cleanly, rose toward his target with practiced smoothness, and his finger found the trigger with automatic precision. But Cornelius Whitmore was not most men, and this was far from the best of circumstances for his opponent. The Pale Rider's draw was a thing of beauty and terror, a fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His hand moved from his side to the gun, but to the trigger in one continuous blur of speed that left spectators blinking in confusion, unsure of exactly what they had witnessed. Dutch's first shot went high and wide, his aim thrown off by the combination of alcohol, nerves, and the shocking speed of his opponent's draw. The bullet whistled harmlessly over Cornelius's left shoulder and buried itself in the wall of the general store behind him. Dutch immediately thumbed back the hammer and prepared to fire again, but he was already too late. Cornelius's gun had appeared in his hand like magic, rising to shoulder height with the smooth precision of a telescope extending. His aim was perfect, his stance textbook, his finger pressure on the trigger exactly what it needed to be. The shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after the lightning-fast draw that had preceded it. The bullet caught Dutch in the right wrist, shattering bone and severing tendons with surgical precision. His gun flew from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered into the dust several feet away, leaving him standing in the street with his wounded hand hanging useless at his side. Blood began to soak through his shirt sleeve, and the pain hit him like a sledgehammer blow. Dutch staggered backward and fell to his knees, clutching his ruined wrist against his chest while blood dripped steadily onto the dusty ground. The wound was clean and precise, calculated to disable rather than kill, but it was severe enough to ensure that he would never draw a gun with that hand again. The entire sequence from the count of 10 to Dutch hitting the ground had taken perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds to end a confrontation that had been building for over an hour. 3 seconds to demonstrate the difference between a professional gunfighter and an amateur bully. 3 seconds to settle the matter of Dutch Kellerman's disrespect once and for all. Cornelius lowered his gun but did not immediately holster it, following the protocol that demanded vigilance until it was certain that his opponent was no longer a threat. Dutch was clearly finished, his dominant hand destroyed, and his fighting spirit broken along with his bones. But caution was a habit that had kept the Pale Rider alive through 16 years of professional violence. The crowd began to move closer now that the immediate danger had passed, their fascination with the legendary gunfighter overcoming their fear of stray bullets. Most of them had never seen shooting that accurate, that controlled, that devastatingly effective. To wound a man's gun hand at 20 paces under dueling conditions required skill that bordered on the supernatural. Dutch looked up at Cornelius with tears of pain and humiliation streaming down his face. His right hand was a mangled mess of bone and blood, and he was beginning to understand that his days of intimidating people with guns were over forever. The wound might heal, given time and proper medical care, but he would never again be able to grip a weapon with the strength and dexterity required for gunfighting. "Why did you not kill me?" Dutch gasped through gritted teeth. "You had the shot. You could have put that bullet anywhere you wanted. Why did you let me live?" Cornelius finally holstered his weapon, the motion smooth and practiced despite the years that had passed since he last performed it in anger. When he spoke, his voice carried no satisfaction or cruelty, just the weary resignation of a man who had seen too much violence and taken too many lives. "Because you are young and stupid, not evil," Cornelius replied quietly. "Young and stupid can be cured with time and experience. Evil requires a bullet through the heart, which is what you would have received if you had been truly malicious rather than merely ignorant and disrespectful." Dr. Peterson pushed through the crowd with his medical bag in hand. already preparing to treat Dutch's wounded wrist. The old physician had been awakened by the sound of gunshots and had come running, knowing that his services would probably be needed before the night was over. "Get him to my office," Doc Peterson instructed two of the bystanders. "That hand needs immediate attention if we want to save any function in those fingers. He will never draw a gun again, but he might be able to hold a tool or write his name if we work fast enough." As Dutch was helped to his feet and led away to receive medical treatment, Thomas Garrett approached Cornelius with obvious relief. The old rancher had been expecting to witness an execution, and he was grateful that the confrontation had ended with disability rather than death. "That was some shooting, Cornelius," Thomas said admiringly. "I have never seen accuracy like that under dueling conditions. You placed that bullet exactly where you intended it to go, did you not?" Cornelius was already beginning to look like a piano player again rather than a gunfighter. His shoulders were losing their military bearing. His expression was softening back toward gentleness, and the cold fire in his pale blue eyes was fading to something more human and approachable. "I aimed for his wrist," Cornelius confirmed quietly. The boy needed to be taught a lesson about respect and consequences, but he did not need to die for his ignorance. "There has been enough killing in my life, Thomas. I would prefer not to add to that total unless absolutely necessary." The crowd began to disperse as the excitement of the duel gave way to the practical concerns of getting home to bed. Most of the spectators would spend the rest of their lives telling and retelling the story of the night they saw the pale rider draw his gun in anger, embellishing the details with each telling until the truth became legend and the legend became myth. Cornelius walked slowly back toward the saloon, his gun belt once again hidden beneath his simple clothes. The transformation back to peaceful piano player was almost complete, but there remained a subtle change in the way the townspeople looked at him. The gentle musician they had come to love was still there, but now they knew what lay beneath the surface, what sleeping giant they had been harboring in their midst. The piano sat in its corner where it had always been, the bullet hole in its frame a reminder of the violence that had erupted around it. Cornelius sat down on the familiar bench and placed his fingers on the keys, testing them gently to see how much damage Dutch's shots had caused. Most of the keys still worked, though a few were chipped and several were stained with tobacco spit that would need to be cleaned away. He began to play softly, a gentle melody that seemed to wash the memory of gunpowder and blood from the air. His hands moved across the keys with the same precision and control they had shown while handling a gun, but now they were creating beauty instead of delivering death. The music filled the empty saloon and drifted out into the street, where it served as a benediction for the violence that had just ended. As he played, Cornelius thought about Sarah and the promise he had made to her on her deathbed. He had broken that promise tonight, had returned to the guns and the killing that she had wanted him to leave behind. But perhaps, in defending her memory and the piano she had loved, he had also honored her in a way that she would have understood. The music continued long into the night, a gentle requiem for the pale rider and a celebration of the piano player who had taken his place. Tomorrow, life in Millbrook would return to normal, but tonight belonged to the memory of a woman who had taught a killer to create beauty instead of dispensing death. 3 weeks had passed since the night Dutch Kellerman learned the difference between reputation and reality in the dusty street outside Murphy's saloon. The story of that confrontation had spread far beyond the borders of Millbrook, carried by traveling merchants and drifters to every settlement within 100 miles. The tale grew with each telling, as such stories always do, until some versions had Cornelius Whitmore facing down 6 men instead of 1, and shooting the guns out of all their hands simultaneously. But for the people of Millbrook, the truth was remarkable enough without embellishment. They had witnessed the transformation of their gentle piano player into the legendary Pale Rider and back again, had seen a man defend beauty and memory with deadly precision before returning to create more beauty with the same hands that had dispensed justice. The experience had changed them in ways both subtle and profound. The most visible change was the piano itself. The morning after the duel, Mayor Richardson had appeared at Murphy's saloon with a proposal that had the full backing of the town council. They wanted to purchase a new piano for Cornelius, something worthy of his skill and appropriate for the respect he had earned. The bullet-damaged instrument would be repaired and moved to the church, where it could serve a different but equally important purpose. Cornelius had initially resisted the gesture, insisting that Sarah's piano was irreplaceable and that he needed no charity from anyone. But the mayor had persisted with gentle diplomacy, explaining that this was not charity but gratitude, not pity but recognition. The town wanted to honor both Cornelius and the memory of his wife by providing an instrument that would allow his music to flourish without the constant reminder of violence that the bullet holes represented. The new piano had arrived on the morning stage 2 weeks later, a magnificent upright from the same St. Louis manufacturer that had created Sarah's original instrument. The wood was rich mahogany instead of plain oak, the keys were pristine ivory without chips or stains, and the tone was so pure and resonant that it seemed to make the entire saloon vibrate with harmony when Cornelius played. But the piano was not the only thing that had changed in Millbrook. The people themselves had developed a new appreciation for the music that filled their evenings, a deeper understanding of the skill and dedication required to create beauty in a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. Conversations during Cornelius's performances became quieter and more respectful, and more than one rough cowboy had been seen wiping away tears during particularly moving pieces. The children of Millbrook had been especially affected by the events of that night. They had always loved the music that drifted from Murphy's saloon, but now they understood that the gentle old man who created those melodies was also capable of defending what he loved with deadly skill. The combination of artistic sensitivity and quiet strength had become something they aspired to emulate. Young Timothy Walsh, the blacksmith's son, had approached Cornelius shyly the week after the duel to ask if he might learn to play piano. The boy had been followed by Martha Henderson's daughter, then the banker's twin boys, until Cornelius found himself giving music lessons 3 afternoons a week in the back room of the saloon. The children learned not just scales and melodies, but respect for the discipline and dedication required to master any craft. Even more remarkable was the change that had come over Dutch Kellerman himself. After spending a week in Doc Peterson's care while his shattered wrist healed, Dutch had surprised everyone by remaining in Millbrook instead of moving on to some other town where his reputation had not been so thoroughly demolished. He had taken a job sweeping floors and washing glasses at Murphy's saloon, working with his left hand while his right slowly regained limited function. The first evening Dutch had been present when Cornelius played had been tense for everyone involved. The townspeople watched nervously as the former bully sat hunched at a corner table, his bandaged hand hidden beneath the wood, while gentle melodies filled the air around him. But as the music continued, something seemed to ease in Dutch's rigid posture, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. It was 3 nights later that Dutch had finally approached the piano during a break between songs. His face was pale and his voice shook slightly, but his words were clear and unmistakably sincere. "Mr. Whitmore," Dutch had said quietly, "I want to apologize for what I did that night. Not just for challenging you to a fight, but for disrespecting your wife's memory and trying to destroy something beautiful just because I was too ignorant to appreciate it." Cornelius had looked up from his sheet music with those pale blue eyes that could be so terrible in anger and so gentle in forgiveness. After a long moment, he had simply nodded and extended his left hand in greeting, understanding that Dutch's right would probably never again have the strength for a proper handshake. "Apology accepted, son," Cornelius had replied quietly. "We all make mistakes when we are young. The important thing is learning from them and becoming better men than we were before." That brief exchange had marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship between the legendary gunfighter and the former bully who had challenged him. Dutch began staying after his work was finished to listen to the evening concerts, and gradually he started asking questions about music, about the discipline required to master an instrument, about the kind of dedication that Sarah Whitmore had shown in saving money for 2 years to buy a piano. The transformation in Dutch was gradual but undeniable. The swaggering violence that had defined his personality began to give way to something quieter and more thoughtful. He started reading books that Cornelius recommended, began treating the other employees and customers with genuine respect, and even attempted to learn simple melodies on a small harmonica he had purchased with his wages. Murphy himself, the saloon owner who had returned from his business trip to find his establishment famous throughout the territory, had decided to embrace the changes that were occurring in his establishment. He purchased comfortable chairs to replace some of the harder wooden seats, invested in better lighting for the area around the piano, and instituted a policy of quiet conversation during musical performances. The result was that Murphy's Saloon had become something unique in the frontier territory, a place where rough men could come not just to drink and gamble, but to experience beauty and refinement without feeling that their masculinity was being questioned. The music served as a bridge between the civilized world that many of them had left behind and the harsh reality of frontier life that surrounded them daily. Other establishments in Millbrook had begun to follow Murphy's example. The hotel had hired a string quartet that played during dinner service twice a week. The church had organized a community choir that included some surprisingly melodious voices among the ranchers and miners. Even the general store had begun stocking sheet music alongside ammunition and dry goods, recognizing that there was a market for culture as well as necessity. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the townspeople viewed Cornelius himself. Before the night of the duel, he had been beloved but slightly patronized, seen as a harmless old man who provided pleasant background music for their evening entertainment. Now he was respected as well as loved, recognized as someone who had chosen peace without surrendering strength, who had found a way to honor both his legendary past and his gentle present. The children especially seemed to understand this balance instinctively. They would sit quietly during his performances, completely absorbed in the music, but they also asked him questions about courage and standing up for what was right. Cornelius answered these questions carefully, emphasizing that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them, from creating beauty rather than destroying it. If you have been listening to this story tonight, I hope it has reminded you of the importance of art and beauty in your own life. Think about the music that moves you, the artists in your community who create rather than destroy, the quiet heroes who make your world more beautiful every day. Take a moment to appreciate them, to support them, to recognize that their work makes all of our lives richer and more meaningful. As autumn settled over Millbrook and the evenings grew longer and cooler, Cornelius's concerts became even more important to the community. The music provided warmth against the growing chill, comfort against the isolation that winter would bring, and a reminder that civilization was not just about laws and buildings, but about the human spirit's determination to create beauty even in the harshest circumstances. One evening in late October, as the first frost painted the windows of Murphy's Saloon and the piano's melody drifted through the crisp air, a traveling journalist stopped to listen. He was a correspondent for a Denver newspaper, traveling through the territory to write about frontier life, and he had heard rumors about the famous gunfighter who had become a piano player. The journalist expected to find either a has-been trading on past glory or a charlatan capitalizing on borrowed reputation. Instead, he found something that defied his cynical expectations, a genuine artist who had transcended his violent past to become something greater than the sum of his legendary deeds. The story he eventually wrote would bring visitors from across the region to hear Cornelius play, but it would also capture something essential about the transformative power of music and the possibility of redemption even for those who had lived by the gun. But that was still in the future. Tonight, in the warm glow of the saloon's lamps, with snow beginning to fall outside the windows and the fire crackling in the hearth, Cornelius played the melodies that Sarah had loved best. His hands moved across the keys with the same precision they had once brought to drawing a gun, but now they created harmony instead of delivering death, beauty instead of ending life. Dutch Kellerman sat at his usual corner table, his damaged right hand hidden beneath the wood, but his attention completely focused on the music. The man who had once spat on these same keys now found tears in his eyes as the gentle melodies washed over him, carrying away some of the anger and bitterness that had poisoned so much of his young life. The children from Cornelius's music lessons had convinced their parents to let them stay up late for tonight's concert, and they sat cross-legged on the floor near the piano, their young faces bright with attention and wonder. They were learning that strength could be gentle, that power could be used to protect rather than dominate, that a man could be dangerous and peaceful at the same time. Thomas Garrett, the old rancher who had recognized the duelist's hands, sat with his hat in his lap and his weathered face soft with memory. The music reminded him of his own wife, long dead now, and of the importance of holding on to beauty in a world that often seemed determined to crush it beneath the weight of necessity and survival. As the evening drew to its close and the last notes of Sarah's favorite lullaby faded into the warm silence of the saloon, Cornelius closed the lid of the piano and turned to face his audience. His pale blue eyes, which had once struck fear into the hearts of men across 3 territories, now reflected only gentleness and gratitude. "Thank you all for listening tonight," he said quietly. "Music is a gift that becomes more valuable when it is shared, and you have given me the greatest gift of all, an audience that appreciates beauty for its own sake, that understands the difference between entertainment and art." The applause that followed was soft and respectful, the kind of appreciation that comes from genuine understanding rather than mere politeness. As the crowd slowly dispersed into the cold October night, each person carried with them a piece of the music that had touched their hearts, a reminder that even in the harshest frontier town, beauty could flourish under the protection of those strong enough to defend it. Cornelius remained seated at the piano long after everyone else had gone home, his fingers occasionally touching the keys to produce single notes that hung in the air like dewdrops. He was thinking about Sarah, about the promise he had made and the ways in which he had both kept and broken it. He had returned to violence, yes, but only to defend the memory of their love and the beauty they had created together. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps Sarah would have understood that some things were worth fighting for, that some lines could not be crossed without consequences, that true peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something valuable enough to protect. The piano played on, its gentle voice a testament to the enduring power of love, art, and the human determination to create beauty in a world that often seemed intent on destroying it. The music would continue tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as long as Cornelius's hands could find the keys and his heart could remember the melodies that Sarah had taught him. In a frontier town where survival often demanded hardness and pragmatism, the piano's voice served as a reminder that civilization was not just about laws and buildings, but about the human spirit's eternal determination to create rather than destroy, to love rather than hate, to choose beauty over brutality whenever possible. And in that choice, perhaps, lay the true victory of the night when the pale rider drew his gun one last time in defense of something greater than himself.